Good day, free citizenry of the world, our free spirits. Welcome to Sessions of Spirit number 33. You might be new, you might only care about colonialism, maybe a little bit about logic and reason, maybe a bit about philosophy, but this is where your entry point is into a incredibly abundant circle of knowledge that the philosopher Georg Hegel introduced about 200 years ago, but that we're still trying to understand today. Maybe you've heard about this talk from somebody else telling you it's got something new in it that you might find valuable, or maybe you stumbled upon it by destiny. But for now, I will give you some context on where we are in this miasma, and hopefully it gives you some kind of ground to find value from where you are at now. And instead of dragging on at length, because philosophers can sometimes be long-winded, I'm going to time myself to do this in about 2 to 3 minutes to go over the first 32 sessions. It is becoming a bit of an art. Okay. So in the first session of Spirit, we talked about Hegel being the philosopher who summed up basically every other philosopher in history. That's what made him so great. For the last 200 years of philosophy, nobody has really understood that because of one-sidedness. Number 3 is that once you do understand it, it changes your life entirely and you can actually change the whole world as well. Number 4 is that you get beyond the stereotypes of Hegel. Number 5 is that you grasp the circle of reason after you get past that stereotypical understanding. By 7 actually, getting inside of yourself this universal logic that's already immanently there. We're going to put it to modern notation to win the Nobel Peace Prize. 8, this modern logic, universal logic starts with polemics, which is painful, but 9, it ends up in like this blessed integration, which is sublation, which is genuine refutation. Number 10 is Hegel was the best at this. He gave us the science of logic, which was a masterclass. Read it. 11 is it's so profound. It's literally the unspeakable telling itself to you. Number 12 is that it's living, and that's the purpose of life. Is 13 to liberate everybody and have a 14 a tremendous connection to a greater purpose, which is God, some people call it. Number 15 is that you cannot call it God, you can call it yourself at a higher level, or just true science as a connection to your inner child where you're alive again. Number 16 is that our gurus have always been doing this implicitly as this science of logic. Number 17 is that we need to sublate the old mysticism into the power of now, the new scientific mysticism. To get truly profound. Number 18 is that the limit of this power of now, this real reasoning, is the limit of our fun, games, and flow. Number 19 is that the real philosopher builds on this through laughter to refute people. To 20, synchronize all the philosophies in history into one system in a joyous, peaceful way. To 21, overcome what evil is, which is really just the religious way of saying ignorance. And then 22 is that we get rid of this evil or this ignorance around our particular knowledge. So we have wisdom governing things like CRISPR before we destroy ourselves. 23 is that we have to make this logic super concrete by using the synchronicity doctrine of philosophies. And to 24, practically start sublating people interpersonally. Number 25 is to do this practically with religions, which are a huge portion of our current epoch. We give a couple of examples how to do that. 26 is that we did the opposite side as well, that the existentialists are also essential. And then 27, we did it with socialism, capitalism, communism to overcome the anxiety and depression that's growing in the world. That's not just material, it's metaphysical, spiritual, mental. 28 is that we also did this with the atheistic religions, like Buddhism. We did this with absolute atheism itself. 30 is that we did this sublation, including ourselves in all this as a part of this science and universal logic. 31 is that when you understand the objectivity of what you're a part of, you become it, you sublate it and achieve this super linguistic capability to speak with universals. To 32, overcome double binds and the whore in the world in yourself incredibly powerfully, even if you're traumatized. So 33, I hope that was good. I think that was 3 minutes, but 33 now is where we're at. SOS stands for Sessions of Spirit, but it can also stand for Save Our Souls, which means that real, genuine philosophy, which we're talking about here with Hegel, is practical, not just theoretical. The topic today is very practical, historically relevant, of course, reason and colonialism, what went wrong philosophically. You can see the image here captures the essence of the talk. Multiculturalism, a unity that is not just this bland, empty unity where everybody is the same. But here's the summary paragraph to get you into the essence. It says, this process of self-recognition explored in Sessions of Spirit number 32 becomes of paramount importance when we consider what went wrong in the past. Colonialism was an attempt at spreading genuine philosophy, but could only do so in the religious mode. Hegel declared himself a Christian, but Christianity was seen as the driver of much war and colonialism. Tremendous oppression and suffering occurred when agents of history tried to implement the idea of their faith. This includes all from the Crusades to the British, French, and Spanish. Each one imposed their sensuousness and culture upon the others, crushing them instead of self-recognizing the universal logic already immanent within each culture and bringing it out from within. The limit of religion is that its representations of the universals are made finite by the sensuous symbols that are used to approximate them. And this finitude is what makes up time and space and conflicts with other sensuous certainties. But genuine philosophy sublates religion and transcends any particular sensuousness into the religion of philosophy. For example, to encompass all modes of sensuousness under one supersensuous essence. This essence is not itself sensuous, but is in the mode of pure thought itself. It does not have to oppress or force a changing of the symbols of the cultures of which it engages, but self-recognizes itself already immanent in them and brings the dialectic of the symbols into a fulfillment of their truth in a way that the spirit inside all agents of history can recognize and determine for themselves. This is what colonialism could not do, because it could not grasp the logic in its supersensuous purity as the essence of genuine philosophy. The same mistake will not be made again by the new philosophers of world spirit. That's us. And to the new people, that's you too, if you feel the wisdom resonating within you. This is something new that has never happened before. And although the presentation might look a little bland, I look like I'm on the Nebuchadnezzar outside the Matrix, you know, there's no colors, it's like all gray, literally blurring into like my teddy bear. But there is some profound vitality and color here in the theory that we're talking about. And we're going to bring that to life with you if you sense that these issues need to be addressed. So let's unpack that dense paragraph. It sounds like what's called purple prose, that I'm just talking pseudo-intellectually, but actually I'm talking with universals in a specific order that I learned after 3,100 hours of reading this philosopher Hegel directly. And if you try and read them, it's incredibly difficult. So I hope you find this valuable and that my struggle is not in vain, that this does apply to real intellectual and practical matters. So let's pick up last time. We're about this living logic. We're about progressing and integrating. So let's integrate last lesson into this one. We covered in session 32 this incredibly tricky situation that even once you know the dialectic, once you understand this kind of pattern is happening, you know, Wittgenstein's language games has this universal in it, and it seems to be metaphysical, and you know, we're speaking language is speaking us. That's kind of powerful to start there, but it's not enough, because these double binds are so tricky that you can actually get up in situations of powerlessness. You can get into situations of paralysis where silence is literally the only thing you can speak, because you're so twisted in your dialectics that even if you know what you're supposed to do, you can't do it. So we know about dialectical behavior therapy. We know about ways to get human minds out of this incredible state of horror, basically, in ourselves through therapies and overcoming that confusion with clarity. Psychoanalysis is supposed to approximate the universals that are animating Wittgenstein's language games, right? Our subconsciouses are linguistic. We've absorbed a lot of culture. But the problem with modern psychoanalysis is that they didn't grasp the science of logic, right? So that means their interventions are abstract as well in some way, which can sometimes, if a psychoanalyst isn't careful, compound the problem, compound the abstract negation and the separation and the confusion, which is why with really extreme cases like borderline personality disorder, where it looks like everything is fine on the outside and you can get tricked, right? The tangled mess is in the metaphysical. It's that objective part of the science of logic that we can't see. It's supersensuous, right? We can't see, taste it, or hear it. So once we untangle this mess in ourselves using this universal logic, the science of logic, and this concrete way of understanding language in ourselves, it moves us to the next stage of healing. So we start becoming genuine philosophers. Even if you're completely destroyed as a person or as a child, it gets you back in touch with your essence, that sort of concrete logic as a child that you had before you sort of lost that feeling of innocence and that purity and that flowing vitality. Once you have that kind of infinite vitality of the notion flowing through you, you can start taking on the world and showing the world that there is a better way to be, which was the point of the logic. Hegel said it's not just theoretical, it's practical. Wisdom and philosophers aren't supposed to sit in the ivory tower. They're actually supposed to be engaged. They're supposed to use their being to make life better. Okay, so then why is life still so painful? Well, one is that Hegel, introduced it, but he hasn't been understood. And it's because there's a continuing trend in history that's flowing over him. And he knew this was going to happen. That's why I think he rushed to write it so densely in his masterpieces. He didn't write those books necessarily for ordinary consciousness because he knew how ordinary consciousness works. It'll twist the words. The words aren't the problem, it's the interpretation. So he wrote in a way where the order, he didn't simplify it. He said at some point in history, somebody's going to read this how it's supposed to be read, and then it will be the pure backbone that will allow them to work off of what he really said without any artificiality, no abstractions, giving it to us straight. But of course, as confused beings entangled in double binds, when we see real clarity, we see confusion. So it becomes confusing whether or not that's real clarity or it's somebody being a pseudo intellectual, right? So as people are progressing with me, if you're watching the logic repeating itself, you're starting to realize that there's something to this. But for the people just coming in, you're going to be experiencing exactly what Hegel said is happening in history. It has happened for like 3,000 years. So he was breaking out of the religious mode of consciousness at his time in history in the 1800s. The French Revolution just happened, and the state was starting to break free of the church, which we see as a victory, but actually it resulted in some pretty terrible things. So a lot of people who are in the religious mode of consciousness right now, we ourselves, right, we're part of it, they're still saying that that was a mistake. And that kind of mentality has continued past Hegel up until the present time. We're still technically mostly in the religious mode of consciousness worldwide, but science is starting to take control of the means of production, basically, which is why it looks like science is in control of everything. With this sort of abstract technology, CRISPR we talked about, it's kind of scary because we feel like there's something missing, and it's this kind of religious unity of things where we respect each other and love each other. But a large portion of the world is still in that, and it's why we're having this mega crisis between two worlds clashing. We have science rising up and trying to break free in its abstract mode, but we still have 85% of the world's population in the religious mode of consciousness. So they're battling it out, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. The dialectic, the unsublated, the unhealed dialectic between religion and philosophy and science. We're trying to heal that in these talks, but it hasn't happened yet because history evolves, and this is where we're going to pick up. How do we go beyond ourselves as individuals to change the world? Well, we have to acknowledge that there is a downside to the religious mode of consciousness. There's also a good side, right? That's what we showed before in canceling sin and all this kind of stuff. We saw that even though love is at the basis of concrete thinking, recognizing ourselves in the other, Jesus, for instance, had as the second commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, love thy enemy. Buddha had the same principles. All the divine masters were tapping into the same universal logic, which was causing you to see yourself in things that weren't you so that you could sublate them and integrate them peacefully and harmoniously. But this, of course, is not what was happening, and it wasn't happening in Hegel's time either. There was a lot of wars going on, and one of the favorites to be focused on in terms of Christianity is the crusades. So Hegel declares himself a Christian, so he's the biggest hypocrite of all, right? The crusades happened in the Middle Ages, I believe, and they were very not representative of what Christians or religion in general would want to be associated with. But I think that was the period of scholasticism. And in Hegel's History of Philosophy, he's very critical of scholasticism, even though he claims himself to be a Christian. But we know that he means the limit of himself in the religious mode of consciousness is Christian, but he sublates all of religious consciousness to achieve genuine philosophy, which allows us to be all of the religions because they're the same essence at different levels of foundation and fulfillment, explication, right? So that's how he's getting away with this. But crusades were happening because the philosophy of the time was abstract. It wasn't Hegel's science of logic. It was what Hegel called a monotonous, barren, ill-expressed time for philosophy. And it delayed genuine philosophy, the type that we're learning now with Hegel. It delayed it for like 1,000 years. He said scholasticism delayed real religion, I guess, real philosophy that sublates religion from like 500 AD to like Descartes, like 1,600 years later, or at 1,600 AD, so 1,000 years later. We're not going to make that same mistake, but it was being made, and it reflects badly on the religious mode of consciousness, despite them being actually grasping the essence of what the logic should be, but they were only doing it indirectly. That's what was causing all the problems. So I took this these points here from a religious site who was trying to justify why religion was good. And they're doing something right, but they're missing a couple of things I'm going to point out here, because we don't want to make the same mistake if we're going to try and create new world spirit, right? We don't. There's a problem with what happened in introducing reason, which is what we're doing. We're taking concrete reason and we're trying to upgrade the world with this universal logic. Well, isn't that what colonialism tried to do in some way? Well, they did it religiously. And we're not going to make that mistake because we're going to be addressing these points. So people in the religious mode of consciousness, especially Christianity, will say, well, the historical claims aren't accurate. Some conflicts have been instigated by Christians, yes, though the reverse is also true. So it wasn't just Christianity, it was all the religions actually. You know, you might have a couple of examples where Buddhism is one of the only ones that didn't have any actual explicit wars. But as we know, there was different factions of Buddhism. There's one, I don't know, is it the forest? There's like a forest Thai kind of version of Buddhism where they're like, no, Buddha said to kill, or any, like, people can interpret it any way they want. So then they say, point D here, violence, evil, and war in general are contrary to Christian ethics. That's right. But the human heart, its desire for power, influence, security, is the true cause of evil, violence in the world, and the solution is Christ, the answer. Okay, so here is where we see a sublation coming. We're going to cancel something, but we're going to preserve the truth, the essence of this writer. The truth is, the way of Jesus Christ is the answer. The truth, the life, and the way, the supersensuous message is what he wanted to convey. That's why he said the Old Testament wasn't good enough. It wasn't wrong. He wasn't canceling the Old Testament. He was sublating it, meaning he was preserving something good in it. But what was he canceling? He was canceling the sensuous, mechanical, dead law version of it. The Lord, right? The Lord is indeterminate. You can't know it or think it for yourself. You have to obey. So Jesus was trying to sublate the Old Testament and say, no, look, I'm showing you this invisible kind of stuff, which we know is the logic, right? The universal logic that Hegel is showing us metaphysically in his science of logic. And he says, you can't touch it, taste it. You have to watch me living this way. I am living this truth in a profound way that you have to just absorb, because they didn't have science back then. So he knew they didn't have the capacity to think it, and he didn't really know maybe how to put it into scientific form, or didn't want to for some reason. It's very well known that Jesus didn't write down anything. So what happened to Jesus's supersensuous message? It was made sensuous as soon as he died. Like, his death was him saying to everybody, there's an eternal life, the supersensuous realm, where if you tap into it with your inner world, the church is the inner world, which we know is the world of the logic, timeless and spaceless, you're going to grasp this way and you're going to start living it. It's going to make you love everybody. But of course, the New Testament has the spirit of the Old Testament, because it's not the principle that's the problem. The beginner, the first enunciation of the new universals of world spirit came through Jesus, right? Came through Buddha, came through everybody at their epoch in history. But what happened was the disciples grasped the essence implicitly. They felt it. They saw him. They got it subconsciously. They believed it. They saw it happen over and over again. They had faith that the world was rational. And that's what Jesus was showing. When you think properly, you can actually align yourself with the world in this like harmonious kingdom, the supersensuous kingdom. But they weren't talking about science. They didn't know the universals and all this. It's like Jesus didn't go to Alexandria, even though he was in Egypt, to learn about Proclus and Plotinus. Neoplatonism didn't exist yet, but he didn't know about Aristotle and what the Greeks had done. That was well known by even that point in history, because Aristotle and Socrates and the ancient Greeks came like 300-400 years before Jesus. So there's plenty of time for the Roman Empire to incorporate that, you would think, but for some reason it doesn't make it into the Bible, and Jesus's supersensuous message was lost in a sensuous message where the followers right now focus on the sensuousness. The death of Jesus was supposed to be the idealization, the sublation into the supersensuous realm, not the actual particularities. And he's saying that's the sinful part. If you hold on to that, you're not going to be able to love your enemies because you have something that you can't change. Your thoughts, even though they're eternal in the science of logic, allow you to see them in any particular form. So this guy here, whoever wrote this, is saying Christ is the answer. Well, the message of Christ is the answer, but people want to use the sensuous person, the idol, to go around the world and throw it in people's faces and say, no, worship a man who is God on earth, look this way, lived in this place. They focused on all the particulars, and then they spend hundreds and thousands of hours arguing about these particular details in history, which might not have anything to do with the actual universal logic that was what Jesus Christ was embodying. That's what made him God. That's why we can say he was 100% man and 100% God, because we can do it too as the Ubermensch. We can become absolute spirit because that life, the way, and the truth is immanent as absolute science. We can determine it for ourselves. So here we see why the religious mode of consciousness couldn't break out of this historical trend and start creating that blessedness, and it turned them into their hypocritical opposites, right? We're so loving, and then you look at history and it looks like, oh shoot, the dialectic struck again and flipped people into their opposites. Because you have to understand the nature of pure thought. You have to understand those double binds. You have to get into that triad. You have to get the living logic going, or else the dialectic will take any ignorance you have and flip you into your opposite. It'll turn you into the evil that you don't want to be. So this is what happened. This is why the religious mode of consciousness ended up doing some bad things, even though it actually had the essence of good things. So we're upgrading this to its supersensuous form. And this is the point kind of the next stage, the opposite, which is that it's not just religion that was causing colonialism and these terrible things and imperialism. We also had the atheistic version. And so this person goes on to say, of course, they negate their opposites. They're not sublating. The religious mode of consciousness wants to point out the limitation in the other, which in this case is atheism. And it says only 7% of wars that were recorded, at least up until 1763, which is still relatively recent, were religious wars. So he's trying to say there's actually a lot of atheistic wars, non-Christian wars. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, even Lenin were claimed to be atheists. They were trying to get rid of, abstractly negate religion, which is why they ended up becoming kind of a cult themselves. They were twisted into their opposites too, and they didn't grasp that true unity that was supposed to create the brotherhood. That's what we talked about when we were comparing Marx and Hegel, that Marx didn't finish the polemic, right? And you need to finish that first abstract negation to have the negation of the negation to sublate and integrate in this living way, this harmonious way. So you can get these colonial, these painful historical trends either religiously or atheistically. So there's something, it's not just about the sensuousness, there's something else going on. And it does seem to have to do with the human heart and the power, like this religious person was talking about. But we know that really it's just ignorance. And we know that the universal logic is already immanent in people. And we have to treat them that way to increase the chances of it coming out. If you treat them by their limit, it actually encourages the limit to manifest itself. And that's what we've been doing, even though we seem to recognize this problem in history. We've been doing this since Hegel because we still don't understand the science of logic. Um, okay, so really the problem is abstract negation. So sensuousness is a version of abstract negation. That's why it fixes you. The supersensuous is fluid and complete. But sensuousness in religion has a fixity to it that prevents you from going to that world. But atheism also has a kind of supersensuous version of it, where they're abstractly negating and preventing that concreteness that's supposed to be the God of the religious, supposed to be this blessed brotherhood from forming. So yes, the problem, sensuous for religion, one-sidedness for atheism, that's another way of saying abstract thinking. If you're thinking abstractly, you're putting things into opposite sides and pretending like you can get rid of one and the other. It's like pretending you can get rid of white to have black, but then you realize that no, you can't, not in its conceptual form. It can happen in sensuous form because Mother Nature operates in sensuous temporal time. It's operating in an abstract negation to keep itself going in a bad infinite, which we call time, linear time. Okay, the thing though that everybody's missing is, of course, the universal logic. It's the right order. That's a word that if you go back and re-listen to all these lectures, that word right order, every time I mention it, I put it in capitals because it's a reoccurring trend that I can say science of logic, science of logic, science of logic. But what I really mean is that there's an order to be grasped. Okay, so if it's not atheistic and it's not religious, what is it? It's just pure ideology. It's the idea of realizing itself over time. So Hegel says, even though we keep having wars and it looks like the slaughter bench of history will never end, actually it is ending, slowly but surely. Through every war, it's just the supersensuous realm in its concrete totality. That's what the idea is always concrete. That means it's always complete. It's always blessed. It's always, there's nothing missing in this thing. This happens in the supersensuous world, right? That world that speaks language, the language games. It's actually realizing itself, uncovering itself through every war, through every conflict, through every colonial disaster. It's trying to purify itself through the dialectical motion. And people who study Hegel say, see, history is the perfect example why you're being naive, Mark, that you can get rid of violence. You can get rid of colonialism. You can get rid of oppression. Because look, it's never happened before. Well, actually, if you read Hegel very closely and you understand the idea, we are actually getting more rational. The rational is becoming more actual. That's why we're in modern society, even though it's not perfect, it is becoming less violent. If you look at international statistics, we are actually in the most peaceful period of human history in terms of wars. We have less wars going on now than almost at any other time. Maybe the pandemic's sort of shaking this up a little bit for a bit because of the Ukraine war and maybe what's happening in Taiwan right now. But on the whole, we are making progress. It's just that for how advanced we are, we should be much farther. And the reason why we're not is because our ideology is not caught up to our technical material progress, because our particular knowledge progresses, Hegel, but the universal knowledge that he really presented has been stuck back in the 1800s. We're bringing that forward to catch the culture of wisdom up with our particular knowledge so that we don't oppress people again. We don't have a repeat of the colonialist moment. But it requires us to realize the idea at the higher level, which thankfully is what Hegel gives us in the science of logic. It's really underestimated, the science of logic. I'm repeating it on purpose because it's people will read Hegel's other works and just ignore the science of logic. And that's the whole, like, that's how you make sense of all the other works. And it's the most painful one. It's considered the hardest text ever written by a human being, but it is definitely worth it. And I'm willing to give these presentations to get us started, to have the faith that he's saying something profound. To make this point even more, that ideology is really at the root of all this, the supersensuous realm underneath the, or immanent in the appearance, is the story about Alexander the Great. So why are we talking about Alexander the Great literally 2,000 years, 2,300 years after he died? You know, he's just a guy. Why are we still talking about him? Because he did something that resounded through all of human history. And it's because he had the universals in him in a very special and rare way. If you don't know about Aristotle, if you don't know about Alexander, his teacher from a very young age was what was the greatest philosophical speculative mind to have ever graced humanity in Hegel's opinion. And that philosopher was Aristotle. weird to think, right? If spirit is progressing, why is the greatest philosopher way back 2,000 years ago? Aren't we getting better? Hegel means it not in terms of the absolute system. The absolute system is progressing, but in terms of one individual thinking speculatively, Aristotle was like the best. He was sublating everything, but he didn't put it all together. And because of the limits of his time, he couldn't jump out of his time. So for his time, he was the best at speculative thinking, and he taught Alexander. So here's a quote from Hegel on his explanation of what happened. And he's going to use the notion, the science of logic. He's using this universal, in particular individual language to tell us that this is the true scientific understanding. I got to think about this. I'm not sure, Victor, if your hand is up for a reason, but maybe I'll take it afterwards.
Yes, it's up for a reason.
Okay, I can take it afterwards.
Can I say what the reason is?
Okay, sure. Is it a sound issue or?
Well, I wanted to point out that in the very title of your talk, you said, what went wrong philosophically? And then you're talking about what went wrong in the past, and colonialism was an attempt at spreading genuine philosophy, but could not do so in the religious mode. And I wanted to point out that colonialism never came to an end. It was simply replaced by neocolonialism, was replaced by the Bretton Woods system, by the IMF, the World Bank, by the finance of Europe, the finance of the US and in Japan, and now international institutions that maintain the much of the land tenure system from the era of colonialism and the disparities of wealth between the global north and the global south. So to talk about colonialism in its relationship to religion specifically doesn't do it justice. Yes, if you start out with the Crusades, okay, and the religious nature of the Crusades, because of some of the killings that had occurred in the Holy Land, you can shape it as something that's religious in nature. But already in the 15th century, nation states are rising, monarchies are rising that are replacing the theocratic nature of the Middle Ages, and it is the monarchs who are dedicating the state up to 70 or 80% of the resources of the state to war. So if you dedicate your resources to war, you're going to dedicate it to conquest, and you're going to end up with land theft and slavery and the slave trade and forced labor and barely paid labor and colonialism, which we are still living with, not only concretely in terms of international institutions, but with its effects, the aftermath of colonialism. So to frame colonialism within a question that is religious doesn't address the presentness of neocolonialism.
That was an excellent point, Victor, and you're going to find out why in about 5-10 minutes. I will go a little bit over my talking time, because that's practical spirit coming into the presentation, right? The theory, practical spirit saying something, it can't hold itself back, right? It has to, the negations are so strong. This is such a powerful topic that people who are watching this and haven't watched the rest of the talk are realizing that I'm only covering the first negation. I'm still yet to do the second negation, which is exactly what Victor just said. You're right, Victor, but let me get to it. So there's something wrong going on here. But Hegel is still saying that it's still philosophy trying to introduce itself in history. But as Victor just said, there's something wrong. And we kind of see it happening with Aristotle, even though Alexander, even though we just talked about Alexander having the greatest philosophical teacher in history, according to Hegel. So obviously, philosophy is not the solution to colonialism, because look what Alexander did with it. He conquered a lot of people and then was killed at the end. They turned on him. So obviously he did something wrong. And then a lot of philosophers today will say, well, that wasn't real philosophy that was so old. That wasn't like real philosophy like what we have now. It's not the speculative kind of stuff that Hegel's talking about, is it? Well, here's Hegel saying it is. So the quote goes, Alexander's education utterly refuted the common talk about the practical uselessness of speculative philosophy. So right there in his history of philosophy, Hegel is saying, not only did Aristotle tell Alexander philosophy, but it wasn't the fake kind that we have today. It's not fake, incomplete. It wasn't abstract philosophy. What Aristotle told Alexander was real, speculative, genuine philosophy. That's what Hegel's teaching us. So then what went wrong? And when we look further into this quote, we say Alexander was a very powerful student. So Aristotle was a great teacher. Alexander was a great student, even better than Plato's students. That's why he ended up being remembered in history, is because he took speculative thought and went around the world with it to try and start sublating everybody. So Aristotle must have taught Alexander the nascent version of sublation, even though it wasn't explicated anywhere in Aristotle's philosophy. The methodology was apparent because Hegel said he had large chunks of the system, but he didn't connect the system's pieces together. He didn't have the science of sciences. That's why Hegel can still transcend or sublate all of Aristotle. But because the cultures were so sensuous back in the past, Alexander knew he couldn't just come in with abstract negation. So he came in, there's a confusing interpretation of Alexander, that he was a great liberator, but then he was also a great totalitarian oppressor. And if you watch his history, when you watch his journey of his 5,000-mile trek, which is incredible because he was still so young by the time he grasped the philosophy. He was in his 20s. Aristotle accelerated his education by 10, 20, maybe even 30, 40, 50 years. And he gave it to a kid. And he was a really smart kid. But there was a lot of temptations. He was drinking a lot. He made little mistakes here and there. But you could see in that 5,000-mile trek that he was trying to sublate every culture he came across. He wasn't necessarily trying to impose. So we like to think, well, it's a lesser form of colonialism. At least the Greeks were better about it than the Christians. The Christians just said, here's Jesus, bam, 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 one God. But back then, polytheism was still a thing. So Alexander went into Egypt and said, hey, look, you guys were kind of predicting me. You guys have all these gods. We have gods too. They're kind of blended. Let's make new gods. It's called syncretism or something like that. Syncretism, where you start blending the gods. But this quote is about Hegel directly mentioning that Aristotle had the right philosophy in chunks, and Alexander was the practical spirit that carried it out. That's what it kind of looks like. But because Aristotle only had it in abstract form in a young pupil who didn't have a lot of world experience, he made mistakes along the way where he started to equate himself with God and started falling down this trap, to the point where Alexander or Aristotle started to get concerned about the abstractions in Alexander's approach, and he started quarreling towards the end. Because in the beginning, Aristotle sent out Alexander, and everything was good. Won all these battles, all the real oppressors, the Prussians who were really doing a terrible version of colonialism. Egypt was under this kind of oppressive rule for 100 years before Alexander showed up. And so they invited him into Egypt, oh, thank goodness, finally. And he let them keep their gods. He let them keep their religion, their customs, but they integrated Greek ones to make sure Greek was kind of on top, to make sure speculative philosophy was the ruling power, right? And he did the best he could, but then he got this weird idea where he had to go to a temple to say that he was actually God. And maybe he thought that would give him the power to conquer the rest of the continents. But these little things at that level of power make a big difference because the double binds start to speed up. They start to become more intense. And as Alexander went across the world, Aristotle became more and more concerned and eventually sort of started acting on his own to start sublating what Alexander wasn't. So you can see here at the end of the quote, there's something weird that Hegel is saying. He's saying, it is also evident from the circumstance that Alexander, while in the midst of his conquest in the heart of Asia, when he heard that Aristotle had made known the achromatic doctrines in speculative metaphysical writings, wrote him a reproachful letter in which he said that he should not have made known to the common people what the two had worked out together. To this, Aristotle replied that though published, they were really just as much unpublished as before. So what's happening is Aristotle is seeing a tidal wave of negation coming, and he's going to buffer himself by starting to share with the people around him what he told Alexander, and hopefully the populace can start protecting themselves speculatively by sublating that negation instead of resisting it to have another war. And he's saying here that don't worry about it, Alexander. I'm not trying to abstractly negate you. I'm not trying to kill you. I'm not trying to turn on you. I'm trying to sublate you, basically. This is not the language they were using. This is us interpreting it with Hegel now, right? They're trying to have this dialogue. And he said, don't worry, Alexander. This is not an abstract negation. I'm not canceling you, because only the people who are already resonating with us will understand what I'm saying, because I'm speaking still in universals. So ordinary consciousness won't be able to grasp it. So that's why you can hide the message in plain sight. And that's what sophists and stuff were doing in the past. That's what we covered yesterday, right? They're twisting people. So he's reiterating here that this speculative philosophy is so profound that you can't understand it. I'm understanding that myself, because as I'm sending out these sessions and I'm on Twitch, like last night on this Twitch channel, which is our particular version of historical spirit, somebody said, oh, I put the capitalist, socialist, communist presentation, session of spirit, as my background, and people can watch it. And somebody comes into the chat and says, oh, this is pseudo-intellectual drivel, because they don't understand what I'm saying, because the categories of their thinking aren't concrete. And I'm speaking in that order very, very fluently now, because I've begun to master it. So Aristotle knows that this will protect Alexander, but he also knows that Alexander's not doing this quite right. And so he's trying to get the people who already implicitly have that logic in them, the mystics, basically, the people who are automatically in tune with the world and don't know it explicitly. He's trying to wake them up, I think, to start preparing for what's going to happen. So there's a really intense internal and external relationship going on that we can start to appreciate when we start to grasp the science of logic in its true power in history. It literally shapes the world. It shapes the events of human beings through every age in history. And you can do it with genuine philosophy, but there's a wrong way to do it. You have to grasp it in its concrete totality. It has to be complete in some way. And Hegel gives us that completion through the circle of reason. Aristotle didn't have the circle of reason. Now you understand why I keep repeating that. If we're going to change the world, we have to do it with the circle of reason, not even with Aristotle, because we'll end up doing the same thing Alexander did. And it wasn't all bad. Remember, there's still like a good and bad with Alexander. It wasn't completely an abstract negation. He was doing enough right to be remembered in history as a good person, but it wasn't enough to stop colonialism from happening, or the first nation versions of it. But there's this confusion that Victor was just talking about, and it's true. We think that colonialism is ended. We're making progress. You know, Hegel's right, spirit is progressing, and it looks like we're improving. And that colonialism was a thing of the Christian past, right? Okay, Christianity is no longer part of the church. We're separating all the religions from the state. Okay, finally we have reason governing things, and colonialism is not happening anymore. We don't have people like dominating anymore, and if they do, we have the United Nations and all the other world powers coming together and berating them and saying, we don't do this anymore, like with Ukraine and Russia right now. But a lot of people say, well, guess what? We have neocolonialism. It's actually not over. There's an invisible form of it happening. And what am I saying? I'm saying, well, we got a supersensuous logic, and we're supposed to go in and like liberate people supersensuously. Well, that's what imperialism is, isn't it? They came in and they are controlling people without overtly controlling them. It's really insidious. It's actually worse than colonialism, you could say. So there's a quote here that I'm giving, which in Wikipedia defines the relationship in contemporary terms between these two, which are often confused. But we need them to be clear so that we don't make the mistake that Victor's talking about. We don't make the mistake that has happened since colonialism seemed to have ended, right? And they say imperialism, colonialism both dictate the political and economic advantage over a land and the indigenous populations they control. Yet scholars sometimes find it difficult to illustrate the difference between the two. Although imperialism and colonialism focus on the suppression of another, If colonialism refers to the process of a country taking physical control of another, imperialism refers to the political and monetary dominance, either formally or informally. Colonialism is seen to be the architect deciding how to start dominating areas, and then imperialism can be seen as creating the idea behind conquest, cooperating with colonialism. They put idea right in there, right? So, oh, the idea, Mark, what you're talking about, this idea, is itself oppressive. It's not freeing. As long as you always have a structure, a superstructure coming in from outside, it's going to cause either direct colonialism, which is physical violence and taking over, or it's going to do this more insidious, invisible version of it, which is taking over people's economies. This seems to be the correct order of things. Even Lenin repeats it himself as a speculative philosopher. He's read Hegel and Marx, and he's trying to grasp the dialectic. And even he's saying that, yes, the Soviet leader, Vladimir Lenin, suggested that imperialism was the highest form of capitalism, claiming that imperialism developed after colonialism and was distinguished from colonialism by monopoly capitalism. Why is this happening logically? Can we explain this? Is it actually happening? Well, yes, as Victor said, it is happening. And there's a man who worked in the industry who's still alive today in the last 50 years. He's saying it's called economic hitmen. It's called economic imperialism. It's super insidious. It's super hard to track. It's all numbers. It's literally the stock market spreading around the world and taking control of people through something we can't see, face, or touch at all. And he wrote a great book about it, on how all these countries around the world are in debt to central institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, these types of things. That's why they have a bad rep. But those global institutions aren't necessarily bad. We don't want to abstractly negate, right? Everybody deserves love. So we're going to have to sublate these international institutions. And we're going to have to address the global debt that was created in these colonialist and imperialist modes if we're going to have any chance at a real, concrete, absolute spirit on earth that is self-determining, and this liberation, in this genuine sense of freedom, where people can take the universal, that incredible knowledge Aristotle was trying to share, and give it to everybody, so that we can start thinking along with each other in a supersensuous way, but not in this imperialistic way. Trillions of dollars have been flowing to basically rich countries this way, and it's still happening today. Now it's happening globally. Global wealth is concentrating outside of countries entirely. There's a global elite forming, love to them, but they're trapped in the same kind of imperialist system, except now it's not country to country. It's literally every country and the elite. And there's going to be a new global state forming, but it's going to be a new world order imposing this abstract logic on us. It's not going to be this pleasant idea. So in fact, Hegel has another quote here explaining why this happens in history. This is how history works. It's brutal. The slaughter bench of history does begin this way, but it doesn't end this way. So here's the quote. I'm going to go over time, but I hope you guys don't mind. This is a sensitive topic. So I want to do a good job trying to sublate all positions. In the history of states, occupations of people are important. But in America, there were no shepherds, no patriarchal way of life, and also no agrarian peoples. So he's talking about in the 1800s, the United States of America is just forming, right? He's rebuilding history, and he's at the very early stages. And he says, agriculture rests on the fact that people build their subsistence on certain basic plants. However, the agricultural way of life did not exist for the Native Americans, nor did property ownership and law, because these are connected with the agricultural. The Native Americans first became acquainted with horses and iron through the Europeans. They were not cultivated by contact with Europeans, but rather were destroyed. The superior culture of the Europeans crushed those who were incapable of adjusting to it. When the Native Americans came into contact with the European atmosphere, they were crushed by it, even where they were treated leniently. There should be a lot of people coming into this talk who are watching this in the future who are absolutely burning red hot right now. Complete abstract negation. That is the exact thing they're fearing Hegel supports. I give you in no uncertain words. He's not even being nice about it. He's saying not only are the Europeans better, but even when they were being nice and courteous to your little culture, that you still couldn't keep up with them. That's how far behind you were. That's a huge slap in the face, Hegel. Why are you doing this? I guess all the stereotypes are true. I guess Mark is totally delusional, making up you're trying to make Hegel into something he's not, Mark. Quit doing that. You're not going to change the world. You're actually going to create your own version of a cult and all this weird masochistic stuff that you have as a personal problem. You just have a savior complex. You're a white guy. We knew it. Okay, that came from his Lectures on the Philosophy of Spirit, page 43. From the exact same work, I have another quote. And I'm not jumping between works. A lot of people say, well, Hegel says this in one, you can quote mine, you can find whatever you want in different works. I'm pulling this from the same lectures. So Hegel is saying this back to back. He's saying, this condition, this is no longer in the, what was called anthropology in the beginning, like when the United States is forming. Natural soul develops into dreaming soul, develops into actual soul, develops into consciousness, master slave happens, and you get to reason. So this is now happening once the stage of consciousness has developed past reason. And he says, this condition of externality, of being beyond oneself, is the condition of being recognized. In an ethical totality, such as a family or a state, all are recognized. Thus, the struggle for recognition has disappeared. In the family, the child that is weak and without desert is nevertheless recognized. In society, all citizens are recognized and counted as free. The freedom of every individual exists only insofar as he is recognized as free by the others, and the others have in him the consciousness of their own legitimacy, that they count for him. In a rightful situation, every person counts because he allows everyone else to count as free. I am free insofar as the others are free, and I let them count as free just as they let me count as free. In love and friendship, this counting is more at the emotional level, but in civil society, I count as an abstract person without regard to my subjective peculiarities. So he's saying that the state might start off this way, this brutal colonial way. And there are stronger, like it's true, abstract negations are working the way. People win wars. Sometimes they cancel. But there's some kind of progression happening where whoever has the more powerful idea translates into more powerful technology. We're seeing that with CRISPR in our age, right? So the idea translates into an abstract form of power that can be used to crush other people who have a lesser form of the idea, or at least not as abstract of a form of idea. But Hegel says, guess what? It's not really lesser. There is something happening here which is taking advantage of the idea, the true idea. And we don't want to repeat that mistake. And in order to do that, to not repeat that mistake, you have to grasp this deeper subconscious process happening where you need to recognize properly. There's a logic to the way that an individual recognizes with another person that can happen as you and another person, but it can even happen between states. It's the same universal logic. Negation, sublation, negation, sublation. And Hegel says that actually, when you do this properly as a person, when the spirit of the people is properly spiritual, properly logical, you overcome even these colonial tendencies of the state themselves. So once you get into the world and you create this universal state, you don't crush anybody. You don't need to crush anything. The supersensuous message is already immanent and is recognized in the people that you're with. And you don't have to adopt the sensuous symbols. You can just use the logic because the logic is immanent. If it's real philosophy and it's leading a society, there has to be universals in it, or else history would dissolve it. So you might say, well, that sounds great, Mark. Yeah, lovey-dovey stuff. At least Hegel goes to the other side and says that, okay, there is a state that eventually loves everybody. Okay, good. But there's still a lot of Aboriginal resentment. There's still a version of Black slavery happening today, economically. If you do studies, it shows that the opportunities are definitely not equal, not even in North America, Hegel's prized state, right? Not even in Germany. So what's actually happening is we talk this kind of talk, but it's not happening in practice. Somebody might say, oh yeah, well, Hegel's coming in and imposing another version of, once you're a part of us, we love you. They're not actually going out and actually integrating people. He's just saying here, once you do dominate everybody, then that you will love them because you can recognize with them because they're loving Jesus or they're loving whoever your sensuous idol is, right? Well, it's easy to love somebody once you destroy them. And that's why we still kind of have all this resentment. People are still destroyed and being imposed upon. Their cultures, their way of life is not being respected in the melting pot that is supposed to be the United States, for instance, this bastion of progress and reason. But it's still abstract reason. So like I just said, if you're doing that, you're not really doing the second paragraph. The second paragraph is truly supersensuous. If you take Hegel just as a Christian and you stop the encyclopedia of his philosophical sciences there, then you're going to do colonialism again. But guess what? Luckily for us, Hegel didn't do that. He didn't even do syncretism, which is what Alexander did with Amun and Serapis, with Ptolemy. He's not even doing that. He's not even doing an abstract version of pure thought. He's not even saying, okay, we're done with the religious consciousness, sensuousness, okay, good. He loved the French Revolution because it separated pure thought from sensuousness. But he's not doing the French Revolution version because that also ended up in colonialism. It ended up in another version of the terror inside of themselves, but also around the world. And he said, that's also not what we need to do to create the self-recognition. That's still abstract reason, chopped up reason. And it's not even as speculative as Aristotle's, even though they had Aristotle at that point in time. He's teaching us something far more profound than all three of those things. That's why we're not going to make a state that's going to destroy everybody and then love them. We're actually going to go do what the Christians said they were supposed to do, what Jesus' real message was, what Buddha's real message was, what Krishna's real message was, what the Bhagavad Gita was. Like, he was in a war, I think, when the Gita was written, right? Teaching about how to overcome this pain and suffering by grasping the peace within and trying to bring it into the world and sort of like tolerate, well, I guess, try to overcome these sensuous pains. Victor, I'll get you at the end this time. I hope I'm doing an okay job trying to sublate, but let me finish that. Maybe I'll address your question by the time I get to the end. And if I don't, then maybe we'll keep recording so that we can show people that we're open to sublating if I really am missing something. So we're not going to be doing any of these three tricky forms of imperialism, never mind colonialism. No economic hitman stuff. We understand the logic. We know how to go out and find the logic and self-recognize in other sensuousness. We don't have any sensuousness as genuine philosophers. We don't even have Hegel. You can say, well, yeah, you got Hegel, you're bringing Hegel in. You can read the science of logic without the author. It's complete enough that you can think it for yourself. It's determinate. The problem with religion was that it was based on faith because they didn't have the science of logic. They had to leave God indeterminate, just like Plato did the realm of forms, right? You can't question it because it's faith-based. You have to feel it, which is where all the abuse comes in. Because when we see logical contradictions, we want to question them, like, hey, like, is this right? And when you're in an ideology that doesn't allow you to think, and they say thinking is sinful from the Garden of Eden, let's say in Christianity, then it prevents you from being a genuine philosopher. And you can't think it for yourself. When you rely on an external authority that's not rational, what happens? You get abused and oppressed, and colonialism happens. We have a determinate version of God, of absolute atheism, concrete God, ourselves, apotheosis, theopoiosis. We're allowed to be godly, and we're going to liberate that spirit in whatever sensuous form it appears. That's why we're not going to make these mistakes. And we're going to be redesigning the global economy because we've also sublated capitalism, socialism, and communism, which is the sublation of feudalism in all the prior modes. And even though Hegel talks about monarchy, he's doing it with the notion. So he's trying to tell us that actually there's a way to have a state that has the universal, the individual, and the particular in the right scientific order where it's not going to be oppressive. But people have to grasp the true supersensuous message. This has not happened even in our legal bureaucracies, which are supposed to be reasonable and rational. They're supposed to be the epitomes of bureaucracy and reason. This is what we call law. There's a conflict right now between colonial law and Aboriginal law, especially in Canada, where the Aboriginals are starting to find their feet. And at least in the multiculturalism of Canada, we're allowing people to recognize implicitly this idea that we can coexist with a supersensuous constitution that brings us together. But it's still colonial. Our constitution is still has residual elements of this abstract logic. It's called colonial law. It's masculine. It's like the dead bones of reason that Hegel said is like Aristotle's logic. When you grasp it unjustified in this non-living way, when you read Hegel's version of the syllogism, it's connected, it's flowing, it's harmonious. But that's not the kind of syllogism we have in colonial law. It's chopped up, it's contingent, it's sort of a stitching together of the best case scenarios in the worst case historical events. And it's not philosophically clear. The philosophy of law is still pretty dense and confusing. But the Aboriginal law is rising now, and they're creating their own law schools. And I think in the University of British Columbia here in Canada, we have the first diplomas being given out in Aboriginal law. This is the universal rising up and explicating itself through world spirit. What this is representing, though, in terms of the logic, the concrete logic, is that we are ready for a sublation. We're not going to throw out colonialism. We're not going to negate it because there is a clarity there. Actually, I said the wrong thing. It's unclear, but there's actually a rigorous clarity to it that actually can help. But we need to take it to another level, and Aboriginal law is going to get us there. We're going to keep the clarity, but we're going to get rid of that dead bones feeling, which causes us to feel like when we have legal status, we're just like automatons in the state, right? There's a deadness in our current societies that we're all feeling, and anxiety and depression is going up, and it's something spiritual going on. It's mental. So the Aboriginal law is coming in to represent not this abstract logic, but the concrete idea. So what the Aboriginals had in the past is maybe a little bit sexist for Hegel, but it's what Hegel said was great in women, is that they were actually a higher expression of this divine logic, that they were the idea. That's the flowing, intuitive understanding, like you know that you know, there's a coherence there, mother's intuition, stuff like that. Hegel's explaining that by saying that they grasp the harmonious nature of reality, that it all makes sense, but because they're not allowed to, or didn't have a chance in history to cultivate that side of themselves, they couldn't participate in the state because the state was this colonial, sort of like abstract, brutal version of the idea. So now what we see is this, if you don't want to call it feminine, just call it concrete. It's this harmonious, flowing version of law where all the parts that are seen as separate and kept like abstractly like rigid are now being brought together in this higher spirit. So the Aboriginal community had spirit in everything. They implicitly understood the science of logic. That's why the elders could channel it in the religious mode of consciousness. They couldn't get rid of it, they couldn't communicate it in the pure logic, right? But they could communicate the concreteness through spiritual terms and mystical terms. But now we're actually going to put it in determinate form. And that's what Aboriginal law is. And that's what's missing in colonial law and why we feel disconnected from it. So we're going to get a sublation in a very material, practical way inside of ourselves by overcoming our double binds, but also in the state by reforming the universals of our constitution based on this more divine logic. Laws that actually make sense in a progressive philosophical order. And it's going to provide a whole new level of clarity where all the marginalized communities are seen and recognized in this kind of state that is actually multicultural, because the sensuousness is not the essential part except for the beauty of the experience of life itself. You don't want to get rid of sensuousness because then you can't be finite, you can't experience yourself. But you can bring sensuousness from its sinful nature into its artistic, beautiful nature. And these types of laws are going to help us do that. And we need to support Aboriginal law without throwing out colonial law. We don't want to do an abstract negation. We want to help them do a sublation and overcome that tension. That's the kind of universal law that we're going to be implementing as the new global community, global state, if you want to call it. So I got a little bit more to cover here. I hope you guys don't mind me going over. I hope this is starting to make sense. We're not just being naive here. There's some real substance. People are actually changing the laws that change real reality. We're not just doing purple prose talking. And some people are going to be thinking I am, but if you understand the notion, right, the universe, the particular, and the individual, I'm just using that philosophical language to explain ordinary concepts that people can't get past. But it's really just the pure thoughts that get us into the sublation. I'm doing something invisible behind these ordinary terms. And we all need to start doing this and recognizing it, because that second paragraph where we're quoting Hegel about everybody being free is not going to happen unless we fix up here. Double binds prevent that from happening. So the key is, of course, education. The limit of our reason is the limit of our friendship. It's the limit of our fun. It's the limit of our flow. It's the limit of our love. Education is the notion developing itself, but it develops itself as sublation, which is the science of logic, as a masterclass. When you learn to read it in this profound way and you get past the ordinary sort of colonial maybe understanding of it, it makes a lot of sense, even in the Aboriginal way. That's why we're going to sublate all religions. We're going to sublate religion itself with all of science and atheism. We're taking all the oppositions and we're putting them in the right order, harmoniously. But there's a downfall to this. You can do this wrong. By education, you could also mean indoctrination. So you say, well, okay, so you're just imposing your Hegel stuff again. Okay, you're not even talking about Hegel. You're imposing the science logic that came from somewhere. Well, the trick, though, is that you can only impose something if you force people to obey it without understanding it. But we don't want people to obey the science of logic, because self-determination is an essential component of becoming concrete God or absolute spirit or whatever sensuous symbol you want to use in your religion. It doesn't matter anymore what you call it. You have to determine it for yourself. And that's what we're going to preserve at every step of the way, to prevent the colonialist or the imperialist notion from seeping in dialectically. Hegel gives us the determinations to allow us to think it for ourselves. We don't have to go anywhere anymore and say, hey, I have this God that's pretty cool. You can't know anything about it, and don't even really try. Just believe me, pay me a bunch of money, tithe, and just be quiet and let me do all the talking for you, because I'm the divine one and I know how to read these books. Hegel's saying, no, I'm giving you a way to actually go and have a conversation where people can critique you and do the first negation, because the first negation, the polemical moment, is really, as we know, a process of clarification to reach a sublation. That's what we're going to be doing over and over and over again, to make sure that even our meta education, the pedagogy, doesn't become colonial. It doesn't become oppressive, because the process itself is liberating. Because the process and the essence are one logic. That's what Hegel's giving us. That's incredible. The first time in human history that we can do all that in one system and not feel like we have to impose it on anybody. Everybody's going to abstractly negate it. We're not being naive. Nobody's going to sublate in the beginning, except for those that are mystics, right? So we're preparing for the negation. Why? Because we're not dominating anybody. We love them because we know what's happening. And they're going to come with the sensuousness and the abuse and the double binds. And we're just going to listen, and we're going to hold the space, because we know what the vision of the future really is. Not naively, we can think it. We can know what it looks like. Okay, how are we going to do this practically? Pay action to the lip service, Mark. Sure, sounds great. Well, we're going to do something counterintuitive as genuine philosophers. We're going to not take our pure philosophy and shove it on people and do this weird process of learning, maybe some version of street epistemology. We're actually going to surrender our egoism, and we're going to go into all those other worlds. And we're going to go into their power structures, and we're not going to impose a power. We're going to go into the welcomed areas, and we're going to say, tell us about who you really are, and we want to see your truth. We want to know every passage perfectly. We're not going to scapegoat you. We're not going to go superficial. We're not going to do what the Christians did and just like wipe out your culture entirely. Not all Christians were like that, to be honest. There were exemplars of speculative philosophers that were able to love and not follow that trend of history. But we really understand what's going on now. So we want every philosopher to be this way. Even better than Alexander the Great, right? Even better than Aristotle, which is a big claim. And the only way to do that is to find the real universals in everybody's particularity. That means that we are making them as wise as they really are. The elders really had truth to them. All that we're doing is finding their message and communicating it non-sensuously. We're giving the supersensuous version of the same essence of their message. And if any of the translators corrupted the message, we will be able to recognize if there was corruption there. But if we say, hey, I think this might be wrong, somebody might have made a translation error, your guru is even better than you make him sound, they're gonna be like, our guru is better than we think he was? Yes. That's the only time a sublation will happen, is when you fulfill, you don't negate. I'm using the language of fulfillment. foundation, fulfillment. That's how you do this work. So we're going to go into Christianity, and we're not going to call them a bunch of Bible thumpers and we're going to go in and we're going to say we are the ultimate Bible thumpers. We're going to basically reinterpret the supersensuous message that's underlying the parables of Jesus Christ himself. What was Jesus's message if he didn't put it into story form? If he just gave it to you straight, what would that look like? I think that is the science of logic, except it would have been way more intense if Jesus really had reached that far into godhood. We're going to do the same thing, though, with the Quran. We're going to go straight into the Hadith and the Quran, and we're going to go as far as we possibly can, every passage, and do the same thing. Recognize the universals, recognize the particulars, recognize the individuals. Same with the Tipikata for Buddhism. Same for the Vedas. I've already looked at the 40 Vedas. Same with the Guru Granth Sahib for, I think, Sikhs. Every single divine text will have universals in it in some kind of sensuous form. And we're going to do the homework of getting to know those gurus, their gods, as if they were our own, because they are. They're in the science of logic already. So we're going to go in and we're just going to communicate with whatever symbols that are there, not in cultural appropriation, because we're allowing them to own it. So cultural appropriation can also happen. It's a problem in Canada. But because we really are supersensuous, you can love the symbols. You don't just tolerate them. We're not tolerating. This is real self-recognition because we see the essence of the logic there determinately for ourselves. We see the right order, and we see that even Hegel didn't have it perfectly. Maybe some of the gurus in the Vedas actually have the right order in a place that Hegel doesn't, and we will have a much more powerful way to do that. This is the only antidote to colonialism and imperialism in all its forms: invisible and visible, sensuous and supersensuous. Basically, what we're doing is we're untangling not only the double binds and the logic in ourselves as individuals, like we did yesterday with our parent-child relationships, but we are finding a way to determinately untangle the trauma of history as the idea worked its way out in wars. We are literally healing the double binds of history in the collective consciousness of the world. We're going to get rid of that underlying resentment. We're going to sublate in this higher essence of science and logic that is going to prevent a new world order from forming and creating a new world spirit to be formed. Okay, I hope I did a good job sublating there. If you're interested, or at least thinking this is new, this is different, you can join the practical spirit. The peaceful revolution is what we're calling it. I hope you see now that it's why it's peaceful. You can go to the Hegelians who want to change the world. If you want to negate me, well, that's part of the process. So might as well do it publicly so we can start getting more people feeling comfortable negating and not following any dogma. If you're not sure about your ability to do sublations and you feel like you're going to oppress somebody and you're going to take your baggage or your binds or whatever that you've absorbed from the trauma in your life and the injustice in your life, or colonialism itself, if you're an Aboriginal, then this kind of quiz is to kind of connect us back to that idea, that more spiritual, connected holisticness that is often in Aboriginal communities. If you grasp this, we're going to start sublating all the philosophers, not just religions. This goes for philosophers too. We're going to do it with all technologies. So if you're concerned about CRISPR or AI, we have a group there for you, CRISPR, the elixir of life. It really is the modern day elixir of life. Here's a way to have interpersonal relationships in a blessed way and avoiding all the terrible ways that result in colonialism or oppression or manipulation. I have a live stream going where we're going to take a survey to find out who wants to be sublated first. And I'll try and show how to do that live in a living way with my live stream still going. We're going to create a new state, which is based on this supersensuous message of the logic, preserving everybody's particularities. And then there's, of course, the universal form of reason itself, the notion to teach you how to do this as you go about it. Okay, so this sounds great. But okay, we're back at the logic. So we just proved that, okay, to overcome these problems of history and the slaughter bench of history, to create this universal kind of history, we really need to pay attention to the science of logic. We're going to return to it in its pure scientific form, whereas before we were covering it a lot in its abstract form as atheism or in religious consciousness. So I hope you're able to love me a little bit after that. And if I made mistakes, please join me in the discussion. And if not, keep sublating and stay free.